Hi everyone, my name is Ruth Shannon, and I am going to talk to you today about genre in academic writing. So genre is the style or the category that your text fits into, and different genres have different structures and conventions. So this lesson will teach you how to differentiate among three different genres. Specifically, we're going to look at a report, an essay, and a thesis. And this lesson will also teach you to decide which genre is most appropriate for the text that you need to write. So that's the question we'll start with. Which genre is appropriate for your text? Which genre should you choose? You may already know the answer to this question because you may have been assigned to write a text in a specific genre by your teacher or professor, but you may not be sure exactly what goes into that genre. You may also have to decide which genre to choose based on the goals of your text. So questions to ask yourself include, what is the purpose of this text? Are you trying to convince your reader of something or to analyze a problem or existing research? What is your topic? Are you looking at a question that you'd like to answer, a case study, or a project that you worked on, original research you conducted? Who is your intended audience? Who is ultimately going to read your text? Is it your professor or your colleagues or the public in general? What structure do you need to follow? Do you know already that you have requirements in terms of format, or do you need to include certain sections? Do you need to have headings? How long does your text need to be? These are all important things to know the answers to before you sit down to begin writing. So let's look specifically at three different genres. Essays, reports, and theses differ in four key ways. They have different purposes, different topics, different audiences, and different structures. So let's go through the purpose, topic, audience, and structure for each genre. For an essay, the purpose is to criticize, argue, or respond to a given subject. So this is going to possibly have a lot to do with your own personal opinion. You want to make a claim about a certain point and use the text to argue that point. A report is going to be much more objective. It doesn't really have anything to do with your opinion at all. You just want, in a report, to investigate or analyze a situation based on the facts available. For a thesis, it's usually going to be a much longer paper, and it's going to be presenting and analyzing original research that you have done, whether that's practical or theoretical research. And of course, the broader purpose is generally to end your studies for your degree. The topic of an essay is going to be a question or a proposition. If you're writing an essay, you want to express a new perspective on an issue that already exists. So how can you add to the conversation about this broader topic? For a report, you're usually looking at a problem or a case study. So you often see reports in the business world. You're looking at a company or a project that has been worked on in the past. This could be real world, it could be an existing problem or case study, or completely hypothetical. For a thesis, your topic will be an original project, so original research you have conducted, a study you have designed, or an experiment you created, or possibly a research question that you are striving to answer looking at existing research. For an essay, your audience is going to be possibly professors, editors, or the general public if you want to have your essay published. These people may or may not be familiar with your topic. It's very much dependent on the specific essay. So be aware of how much about this topic your readers are likely to know. For a report, you're likely to be writing this for an academic or business purpose, so your audience will likely be your professors or your boss or the people you work with. They probably are familiar with your topic, so you should not just start at the very beginning explaining what you're talking about. For a thesis, of course, the audience at the beginning is going to be your professors or your supervisors who will read and grade your thesis. Later, perhaps you'll want to get it published, and then you'll have to consider editors and the general public. You should assume that they are familiar with your topic, but that doesn't mean that they are experts in your topic. So you should imagine that this is somebody who knows your field, but maybe they don't know the specific topic that you're addressing in your thesis. For an essay, the structure is going to be a clear thesis statement where you make the claim that you want to prove or argue in the text, And the rest of the text will be body paragraphs with examples to support your thesis statement. For a report, there are usually clearly defined sections, subsections, and headlines that you need to put in the report. Often this will be provided for you when you begin to write. A thesis, the main difference between the thesis and the other genres is that a thesis is very long, usually over 50 pages, maybe even quite a bit longer than that. The content differs widely depending on your field. We'll talk about some common sections that belong to a thesis later in this presentation, but it's really important to learn from your supervisor or professor what they expect to go into the thesis because there is such variation. For your own text, make sure that you have identified the required purpose, topic, audience, and structure before you begin to write, so you can be sure you are writing according to the correct genre. Okay. So here's our first task. Please pause the video and match each of these excerpts from 3 different texts to each genre. So we have here 1 thesis, 1 essay, and 1 report. Use the information on the previous slides to help you figure it out. The answers for these 3 excerpts are: the first one is a thesis, the second one is an essay, and the third one is a report. So you may have found this very difficult. The reason is that there is often quite a lot of overlap among these 3 genres in terms of both the content and the style, which can make it very difficult to tell the difference, especially in a short excerpt like this. Also, the topic, purpose, structure, and audience may not always be explicitly stated. You might have to read carefully to figure it out. But there are clues in each of these excerpts that tell us which genre it is, so let's take a look. So here is the audience, purpose, topic, and structure for a report as a review. The audience. So we know the audience is somebody who's familiar with the topic because the terminology used here is clearly geared towards people in the healthcare field. So this is probably people who are working in healthcare and so already have quite a bit of knowledge about the topic. The topic here, as we can see, is a concrete real-world case study. In this case, we are looking at implications of the Affordable Care Act for nursing and healthcare costs. The purpose is an objective analysis and a discussion of this topic. The writer's opinion is not mentioned. It's really not relevant here. We're specifically looking at the data and what the writer feels about it is not relevant in a report. And the structure is, it's clear that we have some defined sections and subsections, and these are introduced in the opening. So we know that in the following text, it will be broken into sections that describe the implications of the Affordable Care Act. Okay, so next thing, an essay. So, first thing, our topic. From the first sentence, we know that this text will be asking and answering questions about the work of this particular researcher named Fryer. And this excerpt tells us that the writer hopes to provide new perspectives on this existing research. The purpose is to state and support an argument. So the writer makes a claim here in the introduction, and presumably the writer will support that claim throughout the rest of the text. Note the use of the first person here. Using first person doesn't necessarily mean that a text is more subjective, but certainly if you're going to show your own opinion, as you often will do in an essay, the first person is the correct form to use. The audience, so it's clearly defined here. We're talking to people who work in education. However, this writer is making this specific topic relevant very broadly. So while the audience may not be familiar specifically with this researcher's work, they are familiar with issues surrounding today's schools. So the writer is applying this researcher's work to education more broadly. And the structure, this last sentence is the thesis statement. So this sentence states the goal and the main claim of the piece. The rest of the text will then provide arguments and examples to support that thesis statement. And finally, let's look at a thesis. So the purpose. The purpose here is to present and analyze research that the writer has already done. So the writer is beginning with a research question, and then throughout the research and writing processes, he or she seeks to answer that question. And that's presented from the very first line. The topic is an original study. So this particular writer has done research into these CAD courses, and is going to present what he or she has found out in this text. Your project or research question could be a practical study collecting hard evidence, as in this example, or it could be more theoretical, in which case mostly you're going to be looking back through and analyzing existing research. The structure here is not explicitly stated, but the writer tells us that he or she is going to present the study and the results and then draw larger implications from it. This means that the text will have several sections and may be very long format. The audience is also not explicitly stated, but we can imagine that through the use of field-specific terminology, the audience is probably familiar with the general field. Again, they may not be experts in this specific topic, but they know enough to know what the writer means when they mention this specific terminology. Okay, so now that we've talked about some of the broad requirements and conventions for each genre, let's talk more specifically about the structure. Pause the video and try to decide which of these sections will appear in texts of each genre. Remember that some of the sections will appear in more than one genre. Okay, welcome back. So, an essay is definitely going to have a thesis statement. It will have an introduction giving some context, background for the essay itself. The body paragraphs will contain support and examples for the thesis statement, and the conclusion will provide a summary and usually some larger implications of the text. A report will certainly have an introduction. It will have some background information to give us context. It will describe possibly the methods and procedure by which this data was collected. It will have a discussion where it talks about what these results mean, and it will have a conclusion. In this case, the conclusion may be more of a summary and less having to do with broader implications than an essay or a thesis would. So a thesis is, of course, the longest text, and so it has the most sections in it. It'll have an abstract, which is especially important if the thesis is published one day. The table of contents will tell us which chapters and sections we can find in the thesis. The introduction will, of course, introduce the topic and explain why it's important. The background and theory both serve to give us a sense of the relevance of this research and how it fits into the field overall. The literature review, similarly, will provide an overview of existing research on this topic. The methods and procedure will describe how the research was carried out. The discussion will analyze and, of course, discuss those results. And the conclusion will do some summarizing, but mostly will draw some broader conclusions and implications from the research. So you'll notice that there's lots of overlap among these three genres. The difference is primarily going to be in the tone, the length, the purpose, and possibly also the audience. However, you will notice that they all have the same broad structure in common. So they all have an introduction. They all have a main part, whether that's body paragraphs or the background and literature review methods, etc. And they all have a conclusion. They all essentially have this three-part structure, even though those three parts are divided up in different ways. Also be aware that these sections often, but do not always, appear in texts of these genres. Depending on your field and maybe also on your specific project or even your supervisor, there may be some very different standards and conventions from text to text. This is true of the style and the tone you'll use, as well as for the structure. For example, a thesis written for a business degree may be written like a long report, whereas a literature thesis may actually feel more like a long essay. So even once you know which genre you're supposed to be using, make sure you're very clear on what content your text is expected to contain. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Hopefully you can now decide which genre to use for your text, and if you already know which genre you're using, you can feel confident about the information you need to include. Please take a look at the sources listed here for more information. Thank you very much, and goodbye.